The dream for Africa to trade with Africa has come alive. Of course, it has come of age and expectations are still high, although there's still concerns over barriers to trade within the continent by member nations. Professor Muhammed Tawfiq is the Director General of the National Institute of Advanced Legal Studies, and together we shall be exploring the profitability of the Afcfta for economic growth. Thank you, Professor Ladan, for joining me in this conversation.
Thank you very much, Leah, for having me. I'm grateful.
Okay. Perhaps I would start by asking you, or rather tapping into your background of economic integration law, policy, and practice. It may seem Nigeria came a bit late to the dining table when we're talking the Afcfta. So where is our position as a country? Are we on the table or we're still standing in the doorway?
Thank you very much for this valid question. I think this has always been a frequently asked questions by Nigerians and also by a number of actually Africans. And I think the starting point to locate where Nigeria is to understand actually the fact that the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, short term actually after itself, started in Abuja in 1991 under the Abuja Treaty on the establishment of the African Economic Community as the ultimate goal, of Africa. So because the Treaty of 1991 called the Abuja Treaty itself has 6 phases, which must be achieved according to the founders and dreamers of the Africa for this African Economic Community as the ultimate goal, they actually make sure that the 6 phases, are achievable in a lifespan of about 48 to 50 years. So if you take from 1991, we've had some missteps, and more importantly is that the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement itself is the phase 3 out of 6 phases of the Abuja Treaty of 1991. So Nigeria is still at the forefront. Nigeria is in it because Nigeria has signed the AfCFTA agreement itself, which is essentially on trade in goods, trade in services. It has a mechanism for dispute actually settlement mechanism. And then the scope of the AfCFTA agreement itself, is beyond even free trade area today. As at February 20th, 2023 today, the AU summit in Addis Ababa, adopted 3 additional protocols as under phase 2 to make it 6 protocols. So the 6 protocols have essentially defined the scope as at 2023, which actually is part of Nigeria's effort, to drive the process at the continental level, and then to come back home, to put implementation measures actually on ground. So the fact that Nigeria, was instrumental in the 1991 treaty that defined the phases of the African community in 6 phases in Abuja in 1991, the fact that it was also actually a signatory and today is a state party to the AfCFTA agreement, and it has put in place, as at today, a national implementation action committee to implement AfCFTA in Nigeria since 2019, November to be precise. And we have a Secretary General, Shegun Olo, that is responsible actually for that, with a secretariat team and some consultants. And then you have the private sector, the CSO, the academia, and then all the MDAs, are represented in different subcommittees to ensure that Nigeria actively, maximizes actually the benefits, derivable from AfCFTA agreement. So to answer in summary your first question, the truth of the matter actually is that Nigeria actually has been instrumental to the new business actually continental trade agreement under AfCFTA, and it is also capitalizing on the need actually for both the country and its citizens, particularly the private actually sector, and the CSOs benefit actually from the agreement and its 6 protocols. So we have protocols actually on investment, protocol on competition, and then protocol on intellectual property rights. In addition to the first three protocols, of trading goods, trading services, and dispute settlement mechanism. So Nigeria is in it.
Okay, that's refreshing to know that Nigeria is in it. But then I would want to get your position on Nigeria's trade policy. When we look at, when we try to understand how most of these things work, trade is at the heart of Afcfta. What is your take on the Nigerian trade policy as a whole?
Yeah, frankly speaking, we've been having some missteps, in terms of government policy inconsistencies, poor policy implementation, not only in the trade regime, but in practically almost every sector of the Nigerian economy for decades. And this has really affected, our economy. It has also affected, investors, in terms of confidence in our system, in our economy. And it has also, essentially moved even domestic investors away from, heavy investment, in the system. So it is gratifying actually to note that at least as at today, we have a new national trade policy, which actually was reviewed last year, and then it was adopted and approved by Federal Executive Council in Abuja, in April this year. So we have a new trade policy that clearly sets out our vision and mission, that also, respects our multilateral trade, agreement, obligations under World Trade Organization, WTO, under the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, Afcfta, and then even under the ECOWAS, ETLS, which is the trade, agreement component under the ECOWAS regime. Because Nigeria actually is hosting all the three critical organs of ECOWAS in Abuja. So we have no other choice but to make sure that our trade policy, reflects the vision and mission that will enable us to be the key role player in our regional, trade, regime, in our continental trade regime, and also, in our our global trade regime. And I think what the new policy has done, every policy has a room for every 4 or 5 years, a policy review, depending on the degree of monitoring and evaluation of implementation, and the commitment of stakeholders to actually play their role in the effective implementation of the policy. But I think, three striking features of the policy is that it sets out some guiding principles. It also puts Nigeria to actually trigger the policy, to discharge its treaty obligations under these three levels, in addition to the bilateral treaty agreements between, other nations. And I think it also accommodated a new trend, which is part of the trade dynamics, and that is e-commerce or, e-trade. And the fact that it has delineated roles and responsibilities for various actors in the public and private sectors, to have a role to play, shows that we are making progress in our policy content that carries all relevant stakeholders along, so that we can actually maximize the benefit of why we are in a multilateral trade agreement under WTO at the global level, or under the Afcfta agreement at the continental level, or under the ECOWAS at the regional level. And I think, for me, it is very, very important that the policy, should now have, what is missing, and that is implementation plan of action, which must clearly actually be activity-based. It must have timelines. It must also have some verifiable indicators against each activity. Okay, and then we must also have delineated roles and responsibilities. Who is doing what? At what point in time? What are the indicators we've set out for that particular MDA or private sector or CSO or any other entity, including even the media? If you assign a role and responsibility to any relevant stakeholder, in the policy and in the guiding actually implementation plan of action, then it must be timed to an activity. Then we must verify the indicators. Then we must have an expected outcome to be able to evaluate ourselves. We said we were going to do activity A, and A, B, C, D were responsible in the plan of action, and we set out indicators for them to achieve targets A, B, C, D. Did they achieve it at the end of the year, or at the end of the 6 months, or at the end of the 4 years? That in itself, for me, is what remains to make the new trade policy actionable.
So I'm glad you're raising the point of revenue, and of course, just recently we heard the chairman of the tax reform policy committee put together by the president, Mr. Tawo, make a case for MDAs, over 60 of them that have left their primary mandate of various descriptions to rather pursue a revenue. And for the purpose of this discussion, I'm particularly interested in the Nigeria Customs Service, which was designed in the first instance to facilitate trade, but clearly they've lost that mandate. If we're going to look at the sharp divide that they will be stepping into now, do you see this turning around the fortunes of Nigeria in terms of regional and continental trade?
I think with regards to custom, we need to put things in a context. All over the world, and even by the World Customs Union code and other actually, instruments relevant for their operation, it is very, very clear that customs service anywhere in the world is primarily not supposed to be a revenue generation entity. It is not. Custom is supposed to facilitate trade. And through actually that effort, it can actually provide actually mechanisms, regulatory mechanisms and guidelines and codes, that will promote, for instance, certification of the rules of origin of goods, from where to where, and who is the, and how do you get it actually, better, either import or export. It is also the responsibility actually of a customs service anywhere in the world, to ensure that they have a sense of legal certainty, in their own regulatory instruments, not the scattered pieces of instruments, and regulations that we had before April 2023 this year, when the customs service actually legal instruments was reformed. So as at today, it is true that in the last 2-3 months, we've had a new customs service, reform act, let me put it that way, which took into consideration the need to address, outdated, scattered pieces, of unhealthy, custom instruments that hinder trade, that push even customs service itself, instead of doing custom administration, trade facilitation, determining rules of origin of goods, and then even promoting, electronic filing of actually papers to ease doing of business, in Nigeria, by all investors, and all actually businesses, whether within Nigeria or outside Nigeria or cross-border. And instead of also, making sure that the legal instrument assists custom, to have the capacity to promote cross-border trade with ease. The scattered pieces of instrument before April 2023, essentially hindered trade and also did not really actually assist custom to promote trade facilitation. So the truth of the matter actually is that custom had to pursue a lot of things. Do custom administration, try to actually facilitate trade, try to custom police, borders, and at the same time trying to be a revenue generating entity. Because in the last 40 years or so, customs was actually seen more as a revenue generating entity, than a trade facilitator. So this actually was a very wrong, approach. But I think the new Customs Act has clearly set actually, the record straight that primarily custom service, you have to promote trade facilitation. And it has even actually embedded in the new act, that customs should really actually aggressively promote, electronic filing system, as part of its custom administration and trade facilitation regime. It needs to also find a way of promoting cross-border trade and at the same time police the borders. That to me, is essential, refocus, of the customs service in Nigeria. And therefore, it is not surprising that the new administration under, President Tinubu is now actually, asking such number of entities, not to really be the primary collectors, of taxes. And taxes actually is meant for an institution established for that purpose, and it should remain the primary responsibility of that entity. And I think it will also plug some loopholes. And at the same time, it will also address some abuses and misuses actually of such actually taxes collected. But I think we should also be very careful. I don't think the FRS can still do without customs and all these agencies. I think the idea actually is that they are being actually disincentivized not to be or not to make tax collection their primary statutory responsibility, which is not. Okay, but surely they will have a meeting point to work together and at the same time, achieve the ultimate goal of raising actually, the bar in terms of revenue generation and expanding, the revenue tax base, for the nation.
Okay, so we're looking at the mounting concerns over Nigeria's foreign exchange debacle, if I'm going to put it that way, and you've raised some valid points about that. What is the way forward for Nigeria to actively participate in the continental trade when foreign exchange has continued to remain a great source of concern for people doing businesses and entrepreneurs on the continent?
Yeah, I think this is a very actually troubling, issue for both investors and also even the government at the same time. And I think we should put it also in a context. Nigeria is not an island actually to itself, and the reason being that there is actually a global actually economic crisis. Almost all countries, including developed economies, are devising strategies, from the shock of actually post-COVID era, and also trying to contend with the implication or effect of the Ukrainian war. And then for us in Africa, we were already actually having our own actually major crisis, in terms of triple shocks. First, contending with the post-COVID actually, shock. Two, our own insecurity challenges. And then three, most African countries are in debt trap. So there must be actually some radical economic measures, that need to be actually put in place, to address these triple shocks. And I think, we know that in Nigeria, for instance, we've had some misuses and abuses actually of our foreign actually exchange. We've not actually really put, our, some economic actually, entities like the oil and gas, sector, for instance, at the peak of actually making more money, meaning actually getting more dollars into the economy, from the sale of actually crude oil and gas, we were actually not at the forefront in maximizing this opportunity. So we lost out. We could not actually, sell. So we could not actually earn dollars. So we ended up actually borrowing actually from the international actually, financial institutions in order to even fund our budget, for 3 to 4 years consecutively. And we resorted even to borrowing domestically from our own banks, and then strangely, even from our central bank, giving loans to government to finance actually its budget. And so apart from the poor tax actually revenue generation, there was also actually the collapse of the oil sector where the refineries were not working, so you could not actually produce, refine your own petroleum product, to save actually money, which you now use actually, that is the dollar that is not actually on ground. You still have to struggle to get it in order to actually import fuel into the economy. You can't be, a third largest producer of oil, in Africa, and then be also at the forefront of importing actually fuel when you have 4 refineries, when you have a private actually refinery also that is supposed to actually come on board, a second private refinery also about to come on board. It's essentially, a misnomer, to even call it that we are having a shortage of actually, dollars, in our stock. But that's the practical reality on ground. So we have a lot of misuses and abuses actually in terms of our economic, policies and monetary policy. But I think what is important for us is that we are having a rethink on what we really needed to do and why we should actually address, some of these actually problems. And I think sometimes we need to contend with some actually harsh, policies, in the interim. And that is, how do we actually all get out of this actually, shocks and challenges? And I think the starting point is for us to understand that there must be some drastic measures, that seek to actually say, okay, fine, this is how we are going to address our forest actually scarcity. And this is actually the level of commitment that all stakeholders need to commit to. We are having actually even diaspora contributing between 20 and 25 billion US dollars annually, to our economy. And that was in itself, another, saving belt for Nigeria. But I think what is actually more important actually is for us to understand why, it is important not to support the rent-seeking actually entity or groups. You can't actually be having an economy where the exchange rate and the differentials between the official market and the black market rate, is almost, 300 to 400%. Everybody can become a billionaire, and I think it is true. You go actually and buy actually, at official at 410, or when it was at 310 or 400 or 400 or 430, maximum at 460. Then you go and sell at 760 or I mean, why should I work? Why should I actually, be in NTA in the first instance, as a presenter or as an anchor? There's no point. I need the connection for somebody to simply say, you have actually $1 million. You don't need to even get the money to get the $1 million. But what is important actually is that a bank will actually call you and say, okay, fine, your $1 million translates into this amount. And instead of you getting it to go to black market, we'll give you actually the differentials. And so we'll relax. We'll raise actually the money for you for the $1 million, and then we'll give you the differentials, and that will actually give you almost, some few tens of millions, and then your job is done. You quit from NTA. Why not? Because you're a multimillionaire from one transaction. There is no sweat in your process, no single activity done, and that shouldn't be the way we run our economy. And so for me, I think we may not really get it sharpened too early, as everybody's expecting some miracles to happen. But because the problem is too deep and wide, that we really have to actually, provide some level of assistance and understanding, to our monetary, policy, makers and implementers and decision makers to be able to strike the relevant balance and ease the pains and suffering of all of us. Because it's not only individuals that are suffering, but even MSMEs are suffering. Even the giant business actually, entities are equally suffering. Losing, on the stock market, you can see the red every day or every week. You see the losers and the gainers. Largely, actually, some of them are losing between 300 to 400 billion naira in one weekly transaction. The red against certain sectors. Whether in the cement or in the financial sector or in the actually, food and, agro businesses, sector. And that is actually, because sometimes, people who gain in the past under the very rough edges of the economy will have to pay back. And this is exactly actually some of the things that we are facing. And those who really survive under rent-seeking, environment, are part of those that are crying now that the system is a little bit actually taking something away from them, and they've not prepared their minds, to actually adjust to the system. But I think our focus, largely should be how can the government, fast track these reform processes to ease the pains and suffering of the majority of the populace, and also reactivate, the energy in the medium, small, enterprises that constitute the backbone of the economy of any development economy like Nigeria.
So within the context, the framework of the Afcfta, we've seen the Pan-African Payment Settlement System (PAPS) come up live. Do you see this addressing some of the concerns about our currencies interacting with themselves on the African continent within the context of the Afcfta?
Yeah, I think this is one of the innovative elements, of the strategic implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement itself. It's not enough to have the main agreement that is just 30 article provisions, purely technical, supported, in terms of widening scope by 6 protocols, on trading goods, trading services, dispute settlement mechanism, and investment, competition, and intellectual property rights. The operational tools, are as important as the legal regime. And the, Pan-African payment system is one of the fundamental operational tools, that for me, came on board, at the right time, in less than actually, a year and a half, or so, in actual practice. Its essential actually goal is to ensure that if we really want to make sense out of intra-African trade, why must Africans be trading among themselves, whether trading goods or trading services or regional or domestic investment, within a region like ECOWAS, or intra-regional trade between ECOWAS and East Africa or Southern Africa, the investors moving around? Why must actually, cross-border traders, across the regional entities and within Africa be trading for goods and even for services in dollars? Why? Why can't I sell, 10 metric tons of cement, as Dangote in Nigeria, sell it actually in Kenya and collect in Kenyan shillings, or allow them to actually credit my account in Naira? Why? Why can't we? Because the negative, effect of everybody tied to the dollar regime is that you have to actually go through other processes of the clearance system. And it also makes nonsense of the so-called the largest free trade area in the world. So the Pan-African payment system, came at the right time, as an operational tool to support the ultimate actually objectives and the pillars actually of the Afcfta agreement. There is no sense in you trying to actually maximize the benefit, of why, the Afcfta agreement is promoting as a key objective the largest single market, with 55 economies, as a single block market, on free trade area in the whole world, that has a market access for any investor, domestic, African, or non-African, i.e. any global investor from outside Africa, looking for a market, a single market, with a population of 1.7 billion population as its market, with actually a combined, GDP of the 55 economies totaling almost 3.4 trillion. And you also have, 60% of this 1.7 billion actually people, being actually of a young population, with a rising middle class, with a rapid urbanization, with a consumer spending actually, thrive. When you have this kind of actually market size, age bracket, and then you also have this kind of pattern of consumption, and a rising middle class, a rising actual urbanization, there is no actually investor that will not be attracted to this kind of market. That's one. But it makes nonsense of the entire market and its dream when domestic actually, investors, producers, traders who wish to trade in goods and services, all have to actually wait for a payment process in dollar. When you can actually facilitate a system that you can be paid in any of the national currencies, of the African actually countries where trade actually is being transacted. In that case, even our national economies will be conserving, a huge percentage, of the clearance actually system for dollar regime, because you are easily actually getting paid in a national local currency, based on a mutual agreement. And that in itself will conserve actually, the negative, foreign exchange that we fritter, away because we are looking for, clearance in dollar system. And it will also strengthen our national currencies, because we are using them actually for intra-African trade. And I think, for me, this is the magical element in the Pan-African system. So far, it has taken off actually with few countries testing the Pan-African system, and Nigeria actually is also actually, aggressively, preparing actually to really, capitalize actually on this particular regime. And I think what is also supporting the Pan-African system, is another operational tool on the Afcfta, agreement, which provides for a pilot, takeoff, of 6 to 8 countries on the African guided, trade, regime. Countries like, Kenya, I think Tunisia or Morocco, were actually part of the 6 actually, 6 to 8 countries that took off, to test run, how, intra-African trade can take place, using actually the tariff, regime agreed by almost 90%, and then also using actually the Pan-African payment system, as a pilot actually to see how it works. So for me, the fact that we have a continental bank, African Exim Bank, preparing actually all the actually, framework and the platform to ease this payment system is a plus actually for Afcfta agreement, framework. And it's also actually another plus for all the African national economies. And I think, Nigeria should aggressively actually grab it, because our actually, investors, and also our businesses, have more actually, to gain. And we've been having actually, a lot of actually, interest in the private sector trying to grab, the system. And I think our financial institutions are already, investing in a number of African countries, So we are already, in terms of financial services, which is trading services, we are already rendering financial services, to other African countries, like First Bank, Zenith Bank, Access Bank. They're operating in a number of countries, just like MTN and Dangote Cement in a number of African countries. That's the way to go. These are businesses, and investors, that can benefit primarily from the Pan-African system, and then the nations will also actually benefit in terms of economic growth.
So on the whole, where should Nigeria's policy thrust for trade be looking at, considering the fact that we have found ourselves as a nation in dire need of income by all means?
I think this is a fair question to, at this initial stage, assess Nigeria and also provide some piece of advice. In the first instance, I can confidently say that we have a national trade policy which probably took us, 10 years plus, to get it, out. At least it's out. As imperfect as it may seem by some actually stakeholders. That's number one. For me, Nigeria needs to actually ensure that, we have professionalism in our ministries, such that policy implementers, must have that professional expertise, to be able to, guide in the implementation of our national policies on trade, on investment, on competition, and then to ensure that, our businesses, essentially have the fertile grounds and then enabling actually legal and policy environment to thrive. And I think the second point, in my view, is that Nigeria, in fairness actually to the last administration and the current administration, we've also have actually, for instance, 4 strategic instruments that at least shows from the legal point of view that Nigeria is committed to laying the necessary actually, framework for our businesses, including MSMEs, to thrive. For instance, we have the Business Facilitation, Act 2023, which was actually assented by President Buhari in March 2023 this year. And the ultimate goal of this business facilitation, and even by the name, by the title of the act, is to ease the doing of business. And the target group are essentially medium, small enterprises, micro enterprises, domestic, investors, and also, the entire private sector. And what the act has done was to actually review, scattered pieces of legal instruments that have existed for years or for decades that hinder trade. They make trade unpalatable, they discourage actually investors, and they also make nonsense of our effort, to provide an enabling environment for MSMEs and even individual businesses and domestic investors to thrive. So we couldn't even attract foreign investors as much as we could, talk less of actually domestic investors. So this is one instrument has actually done one reform that is necessary to prepare Nigeria and Nigerian businesses to thrive and to grab the Afcfta agreement, including, ECOWAS regime, and then make actually the best out of it for both the nation to gain, and then for the businesses to also actually, have a profit-driven interest, gained. So the third point, in my view, is that we've also had, as at April 2023, we've had, Customs Service Reform Act. It's very, very important to mention this because many people have not accessed these instruments. And even the Customs Service itself, just 3 weeks ago, I was actually at the first retreat for the entire customs management under the new, acting DG of Customs. Customs under the new act, which is just 3-4 months old, had their first retreat to sensitize even their own management, all of them in attendance, and we took them through as to why the new Service Act is an essential reform act. Because in the last 50, 60 years, can you imagine that the Nigerian customs have been operating under a 63-year-old, pre-independence law? For goodness sake, how can you run? Why won't custom, partially abandon its statutory responsibility to be chasing revenue and collecting taxes when it is not its statutory mandate? The truth of the matter actually is that the April 2023 Customs Service Act is a game changer. That's the summary of it all. Game changer in the sense that it has actually, pushed actually customs to be ICT compliant. Why should actually, stakeholders be going through manual processing of filing documents, going to offices and all the kind which provides room for all kinds of, corrupt practices and what have you, and delay in processing even documents, and then you have our ports, unnecessarily congested because of some analog operators, in the customs, service. So the customs service Act 2023 from April actually said, no. You have to go 100% ICT compliant. Interest actually parties should be filing their papers, electronically. That's one. Two, you must also actually, find a way of enhancing your capacity to promote rules of origin and certification of rules of origin of goods. Because this is one of the pillars of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement on trading goods. Where is the origin of a particular goods that you are trading in? So you need to be certificated so that if this particular ginger is labeled made in Nigeria, there must be proof of its origin so that other countries will not actually, steal it and label it and say it's actually from Kenya. There is a debate. Let me give you one example. There is an ongoing debate, as to, for instance, the origin of kilishi. Is it from Niger or from Nigeria? Jollof rice. The competition between Senegal and actually Nigeria. And then you even have, some packages, that essentially Nigeria should be actually at the forefront competing and asserting this authority. We are yet to get our acts in order to enable us to be more competitive. So two instruments are paving way for this particular level of competitiveness. I think that's the point I'm driving at. So the Business Facilitation Act 2023 and the Customs Service Reform Act 2023. Finally, is another instrument that I think is very, very important. Nigerian Startups Act. The Afcfta is promoting inclusivity of women and youth under its, maybe third phase of the Afcfta agreement, protocols. So there is a protocol on e-commerce, and there's also another protocol that is currently being actually undergoing, negotiation, and the protocol on women and youth. Because they've realized that even if you promote trading goods, trading services, dispute settlement mechanism, you promote investment, competition, and protect intellectual property rights, you are still going nowhere if you don't promote e-commerce and you also don't promote, inclusivity of women and youth. So inclusivity of women and youth is key. And that is actually very, very important. And as far as actually we are concerned, the instrument that adds value to Business Facilitation Act, Customs Service Act 2023 is the Startup Act 2022 rather. But I think the last point is that we also have, Nigerian Copyright Act 2023. The Nigerian Copyright 2023, is also a reform legislation, which seeks to also, provide a basis for enhancing the protection of the intellectual property rights regime, which is also the core of Afcfta agreement itself. And that's why Afcfta agreement devoted actually, a whole protocol on intellectual property rights, on it. So let me actually summarize and put it, this way, that Nigeria, at least between 2022 and 2023, is showing its readiness, to make Nigerian businesses, including MSMEs, and then the Nigerian economy itself, to be ready for competitiveness. That's number one. Number two, it is also clearing actually, the framework, the ground or the basis for Nigerian actually, agencies and regulatory bodies to be able to effectively facilitate trade and then promote ease of doing business. So we may still have a long way to go, but as at today, frankly speaking, we have both policy and legislative actually initiatives that seek to, facilitate trade, respect multilateral, trade agreements, and then make inclusivity of women, youth, MSMEs, in addition to bigger domestic investors and global businesses to be relevant stakeholders. And I think this is the way we should be encouraging the government to go. One final word in my view is we need to also fix our infrastructure deficit. You know, we must address the gaps because energy deficit, transportation deficits are key infrastructure to drive, investment and trade, in Africa, and also to make us more competitive, in attracting, foreign investment.
I must sincerely thank you, Professor Ladan, for making our time to join this conversation.
Thank you very much. I'm grateful for having me.